Putin's most heavily armed fortress in Europe is running dry. Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave wedged between Lithuania and Poland on the Baltic coast, has been reduced to just 2 functioning public gas stations as of July 9, 2026. The question hanging over this story is whether Ukraine's campaign against Russia's oil infrastructure has finally found the pressure point that no missile or drone strike on the front line ever could. Russia's military doctrine has long assigned exceptional importance to Kaliningrad. Moscow regards the exclave not merely as territory, but as a strategic bastion protecting access to the Baltic Sea and demonstrating Russian power in northern Europe. For years, it was sold to the Russian public as an untouchable stronghold, a dagger pointed at the heart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's eastern flank. Today, that dagger's handle is exposed in a way nobody in the Kremlin anticipated. In 6 regions of Russia, gasoline has effectively disappeared from the market for the general public amid the fuel crisis. In the Kaliningrad region, only 2 gas stations remain operating. That's not a temporary inconvenience, that's a fortress grinding to a halt. To understand how Kaliningrad ended up here, you have to trace the campaign that brought Russia's energy sector to its knees. Since the end of May, Russia's fuel crisis has worsened amid intensifying Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow, deliberate bleed carried out over months by Ukraine's long-range strike program. In each attack on Russian oil facilities, swarms of long-range drones have flown more than 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border to destroy oil storage tanks and shipping infrastructure, sparking sky-high fires that have lasted for days. The targets weren't random. Ukraine went after the arteries, the refineries, the export terminals, the storage hubs that feed fuel across the entire country. The Primorsk port, which mostly handles crude oil, and Ust-Luga, which boasts a colossal complex of oil processing facilities and export terminals, both appeared damaged and blackened by fire in satellite images. As a result, both ports were still unable to ship any cargo, forcing traders to send oil and oil products to smaller ports on the Baltic or Black Sea, which could not handle the new load. Those 2 ports on the Baltic Sea are critical to understanding Kaliningrad's particular vulnerability. The exclave has no land connection to the Russian mainland that bypasses North Atlantic Treaty Organization and European Union territory. It depends on sea routes through the Baltic for its fuel supply. When Ukraine burned Ust-Luga and Primorsk, it didn't just hurt St. Petersburg, it cut the supply artery feeding Kaliningrad from the Baltic side. Ukrainian drone attacks reached a record level of 14 refineries targeted in a single month, while 21 out of Russia's 38 large refineries had been hit since January 2025. The cumulative effect of that campaign is now visible in the numbers. By early July 2026, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine estimated nearly 43% of Russia's oil refining capacity had been disabled. The Financial Times reported that Russia produced 4.1 million barrels of oil per day in June 2026, which is 28% below the 5-year average and 35% below design capacity. The fuel shortage had so far affected 50 million people, 35% of the Russian Federation's population. That figure is staggering for a country that calls itself an energy superpower. By July 2nd, Novaya Gazeta Europe estimated that the fuel crisis had spread to at least 78 of the 83 internationally recognized regions of the Russian Federation, plus occupied Crimea and Sevastopol. Only 5 regions had not yet reported a crisis. Kaliningrad wasn't one of them. In Kaliningrad, limits on fuel sales took effect on June 25th. At a meeting in Moscow, Kaliningrad Governor Alexei Bezprozvanik asked Vladimir Putin to prioritize additional fuel deliveries to the exclave, and the president agreed. The moment that meeting happened, the moment a governor had to personally fly to Moscow to beg for gasoline, was the moment it became undeniable that Russia's showcase Baltic garrison was in serious trouble. Putin also backed the governor's request to contribute federal funds to airfares for Kaliningrad residents, described as a traditional form of subsidy, and to procure more ferries for the region. More ferries. That detail matters. It means Moscow knows its sea-based supply chain to the exclave is broken and is scrambling to patch it with additional vessels. Now consider the strategic picture that emerges from that scramble. Kaliningrad hosts Russia's Baltic Fleet headquarters. It carries a dense concentration of surface-to-air missile batteries, electronic warfare systems, and ballistic missile infrastructure. Russia's Baltic Fleet, together with coastal defense, ballistic and cruise missiles, air defense systems, aviation assets, and ground forces, was designed to deny North Atlantic Treaty Organization naval access to the Baltic Sea in a war. All of that hardware needs fuel. All of that machinery needs diesel. The question that should now be asked is this: if civilian Kaliningrad can't fill up a car, what exactly is happening to the military's logistics chain on the same territory? Authorities in the Kaliningrad region say additional fuel deliveries have been arranged and temporary restrictions introduced to stabilize the market. Government vehicles continue to receive fuel even in the hardest-hit regions, as they are allowed to bypass queues or use separate supply channels. That official denial is telling. It confirms the queue system is real. It confirms that government and military vehicles are being prioritized, which means civilian supply has been explicitly deprioritized in favor of keeping the state apparatus mobile. In the Kaliningrad region, motorists are limited to 30 liters of gasoline and 60 liters of diesel per vehicle. Those caps came before the situation deteriorated to 2 operating stations. The caps were followed by near-total pump closure. The trajectory here isn't toward stabilization, it's toward collapse. Rising transit costs, shortages of construction materials and fuel, and restrictions on the import of critical goods pose long-term challenges for the region. As a result, Kaliningrad is becoming a weak link in the Russian economy, formally showing some positive indicators while actually facing systemic problems that undermine social stability. This assessment came from Ukrainian foreign intelligence before the crisis fully peaked. It has since proven accurate. Kaliningrad has become one of the most illustrative regions demonstrating the destructive effects of the war. Logistics failures, air ticket shortages, rising prices, and the need for constant budgetary support all highlight the systemic weakness of the Russian economy. The fortress is not just running low on fuel, it's running low on the basic economic conditions that make a functioning military garrison possible. The western exclave of Kaliningrad saw gasoline prices rise by nearly 4 rubles to 69.9 rubles per liter over just 2 months. Price spikes at this speed, in a region under rationing, signal one thing: supply is failing faster than the market can adjust. Russia's response has been a combination of denial and damage control. The Kremlin acknowledged that gasoline production had decreased in some areas, but said it saw no risks of nationwide shortages. Russia's energy ministry said supply in the domestic gasoline market remains stable and under control. A total ban on gasoline exports remains in force through July 31st. Banning exports while telling the public there's no shortage. That contradiction speaks louder than any official briefing. The attacks have forced Russian authorities to introduce fuel rationing across large parts of the country, draw on strategic reserves, and consider the rare step of importing gasoline, highlighting the growing strain on Russia's domestic fuel market more than 4 years into the war. Russia importing gasoline would have been unthinkable at any point in the previous decade. It is now being discussed at the highest levels of government. Russia has also begun diverting gasoline from Belarus that had originally been intended for Central Asian countries. However, even record-high deliveries have failed to fully eliminate the shortage. This is the regime raiding its own neighborhood to keep its own regions from going dark. It is not the behavior of a country with a fuel situation under control. A key driver of this process has been the systematic targeting of Russia's fuel, energy, and logistics infrastructure, resulting in localized and regional fuel shortages, mobility restrictions, transportation disruptions, and increasing administrative control over resource distribution. The most illustrative examples can be observed in occupied Crimea, Sevastopol, and Russia's southern regions, where fuel shortages have led to the introduction of wartime-style rationing measures, including fuel purchase limits, QR code access systems, and priority allocation for security services. Kaliningrad is now sharing that same wartime-style reality. A region that Moscow spent years presenting as a symbol of Russian power in Northern Europe is now rationing fuel by QR code, with government vehicles skipping the queue while civilians wait at the 2 stations still open. Citizens are confronted with queues, fuel purchase restrictions, and refueling limits. This discrepancy between the official narrative and lived reality gradually undermines trust in government information sources. That erosion of trust doesn't stay contained to fuel policy. It bleeds into trust in the war itself. Finnish President Alexander Stubb stated in early July 2026 that Russia's capacity to produce and export oil had been reduced by 40% due to Ukrainian mid- and long-range drone strikes. When a neighboring head of state is publicly citing that figure, it's no longer a contested claim. It's a recognized strategic fact. While Putin claimed Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian oil facilities have absolutely no effect on the situation at the front, Western military analysts say the strikes have hampered military logistics and slowed the tempo of Russia's advance, leaving the battlefield in a stalemate. The Kremlin's public line and the ground reality are now pointed in opposite directions. Kaliningrad has always served as a dagger pointed at North Atlantic Treaty Organization territory, but the dagger's handle remains exposed. That exposure is no longer theoretical. With supply routes compromised, civilian infrastructure rationed, and the governor making emergency trips to Moscow, the handle of that dagger is now visibly weakening. What Ukraine has achieved in Kaliningrad, it didn't achieve with a single dramatic strike. It achieved it through persistent, compounding pressure on the supply chain upstream. The Lyuty drone, with a range of roughly 2,000 kilometers, is capable of reaching Kaliningrad without crossing a single meter of North Atlantic Treaty Organization airspace. The Lyuty is the best-known example of Ukraine's ultra-long-range drone capability, with a range of about 2,000 kilometers, plenty enough to reach Kaliningrad without entering North Atlantic Treaty Organization airspace. It was the Lyuty that previously struck Ukhta, deep inside Russia. Kaliningrad's supply infrastructure remains a potential target in a campaign that has already proven it can reach the furthest corners of Russian territory. The fortress isn't smoking, it isn't under fire. It's doing something potentially more damaging. It's seizing up from the inside as the energy supply that sustains it slowly disappears. What happens next could define whether Kaliningrad is a functioning military garrison or an isolated symbol, heavy with hardware but starved of the fuel that makes it move. Does Russia have any realistic path to restoring Kaliningrad's supply chain while Ukraine's drone campaign continues at this pace? And if the military's fuel priority is already crowding out civilian supply in the exclave, how long before that trade-off becomes a strategic vulnerability NATO can exploit? Tell me what you think in the comments.